Okay, we are learning Lila Nishmas Mindel Mariam Bas Kamen Ruvain. We are on Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, the first Mishnah towards the bottom of the page, and here we go. So Milyar HaGaruf, okay, a milyar. We'll see what a milyar is that was shoveled. All the coals were shoveled out before Shabbos. Shosin Himenum b'Shabbos. You're allowed to drink from it on Shabbos. Okay. Basically, the goal is that once the coals are removed, then it's something which retains heat, and basically it's just going to keep on cooling off over Shabbos, and therefore there's no problem drinking from it on Shabbos. Antichi, however, is something called an antichi. The Gemara is going to talk about what exactly it is. Afal pisha grufa, even if the coals are shoveled out, ein shosin himena, a person is not allowed to drink from it. Okay, and we'll see the basic premise, at least the way Rashi understands it, is that it's going to even an antichi, just the way it's structured, is that even after the coals are removed, it's going to be mosif hevel, and increases heat, and therefore you're not allowed to use it. Okay, so the Gemara asks, Hechidami mulyar hagarov, what is the case of this mulyar that the coals are cleared from it? Tana mayim mibifnim v'gechala mibachutz. Okay, so a milyar, so meaning the Gemara wants to define what exactly it is. A milyar is something which has water on the inside and coals are on the outside. Okay, so basically it's like something which is kind of surrounded by coals. And so the idea of a milyar that is shoveled means the coals are cleared away from around it. Antichi, Rabba Amar Beibari, it's something which is... it basically is it has like there's like basically two walls, and there is not two walls but two compartments, and one side is water and one side is coals, so it's basically something which is much more compact. Rav Nachman B'Yitzchak Amar Be Dude. It's a pot which kind of has the same this idea of coals attached to it. So here it's, according to the second opinion, there are coals on the bottom and there's water on the top. Okay, so Mandamar Beidude, the one who says that it's this two-storied pot, Kol Shekain Beikire, certainly there's going to be an issue when it's almost like an oven where it has hot water on, like water on one side and coals on the other, and apparently gets even hotter. Umandamar Beibiri, and someone who understands that it is a pot which has coals on the bottom and water on top of al beidude lo. Sorry, the one who holds that the antichi is something which is compartmental. In other words, there is coals on one side and there is water on the other side. When it's going to be two-storied, in other words, the coals on the bottom and the water on top, it's not going to be as hot, and therefore they would hold that it is mutter. Tani Kavas Rav Nachman, antichi af pi shegrufa ktuma ein shosin imena mipnei shenechushta mechama. The reason, so opinion that goes like Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman was the second opinion who says that it's like a two-story thing. The brisa seems like it goes like this because the fact that it says that the bottom, the translation of nechushta over here is not like nechoshes, like the metal, but rather the idea is that the bottom heats it up, and therefore it certainly sounds like the antuchi is something which has heat coming from the bottom, as opposed to like an oven-like structure which has heat on one side and water on the other. Okay, so these these are not structures that are used that we use nowadays. So it's hard to extrapolate a practical application of these ideas. Okay, but that is the Mishnah, that is the Gemara. Let's get into a Mishnah which does have significant applications to our lives. Yes.
I'm just curious, why would we be discussing drinking from them?
In other words, the point is using them at all is basically meaning once they're already set up, a person cannot use it, meaning if a person goes ahead and insulates in a way that's forbidden, you would not be able to use such a structure on, let's say a person insulated, forget these things. A person did insulation, hatzmana, in a illegal fashion, then you would not be able to use the food that was insulated on Shabbos.
Right, okay.
So yeah, we're going to get more into that, like meaning when d'oraisas, d'rabanans, and how long you'd have to wait to do so. But we'll hold off on that for now. But yeah, that's going to be a big discussion about. We touched upon it a little bit before, but we're going to get a little bit more extensive discussion about that. Okay, here we go. Hamecham shapinahu. Okay, so you have a kettle that was cleared. Okay, and the Gemara is going to see two opinions what it means, a kettle that was cleared. What exactly does it mean that it was cleared? Does it mean it was taken out of the oven? We'll see the two opinions are basically, does it mean that it was taken off of the oven, meaning the kettle itself was cleared, or the kettle, the water from the kettle was cleared? And we'll see some nafkaminas between these two opinions. Lo yitin l'sochot sonen b'shvil sheicham. A person should not put cold water into this kettle to the point that the water is going to get hot. Okay, so you're not allowed to add water to a kettle to the point that it's going to get hot. Aval nosin hu l'socho o l'socha kos kedei lafshir. And you are allowed to put enough cold water into it that to allow it to warm up. Okay, in other words, the Gemara over here is distinguishing between, the Gemara is distinguishing between putting water into the measurement that it would take, that it would make the water hot, right? So in other words, if there's a little bit of cold water going into hot water, the cold water is going to get hot. That is going to be forbidden. The question is, but what the Gemara is allowing is for a person to put more cold water to the point that the cold water gets warm, right? So that is going to be permitted. That therefore there's no bishul, there's no heating up. And then the Mishnah also says l'socha kos, into a cup. What do I mean into a cup? What that means is that let's say I take the water from the kettle and I pour it into a cup. There I'm also allowed to pour water into that cup. Now, what the simple read of the Mishnah is that even in that cup, I'm only allowed to put enough water that it warms the water up. Right, which would seem to imply that what we call a klisheni. In other words, I take water out of the kettle, I pour it into another container. I'm only allowed to pour enough water to make it warm up. Many of the Rishonim understand that no, it's just that in this context, it's just talking about warming up because it's putting it together with putting cold water into the kettle, and it's contrasting with what's usher and what's mutter. But the truth is, if the Mishnah would get into more details, it would distinguish. In a kli rishon, I'm only allowed to put cold water that it would make it warm, not hot. But in the cup, meaning really the Mishnah could have had a third paragraph, or it could have a third clause, where it would have said, but when it's into a klisheni, there I'm even allowed to put a small amount of cold water, enough that it heats up, because in a klisheni, there is no concept of heating up. And that's the approach that most Rishonim take, that in a kli rishon, so I take the kettle off the fire, right? That's the kli rishon, no longer on the fire. If I put a little bit of cold water, it's going to get hot. I'm not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Now, okay? Because in a kli rishon, it has the capacity to really heat things up. If I put a good amount of cold water, that it's just making the water now warm, that it doesn't take the cold water and make it hot. So now you can feel a difference in the temperature of the water. It made it not just feel a difference, but it made the water is not hot. The water is cold. Then that is going to be permitted. And then in the case of a cup, according to most Rishonim, not everyone, but according to most Rishonim, once I pour the water of the kettle into another cup, there I could pour even a little bit of water, even though it's going to be hot. So let's say making a tea on Shabbos, for those who make teas, right? So let's say you do a tea, you want to do a kli shlishi even, right? You don't want to do it in the kli sheni, do kli shlishi, but the tea's hot, so you want to make it a little bit cooler. So obviously you don't want to make it like warm. So if you add a lot of water, that's for sure mutter. But let's say you want to just add a little bit of water, it's still very hot. So according to the way that most Rishonim read it, that would be mutter, even though the water is getting very hot. That would not be a problem since it's a kli sheni / kli shlishi. So practically the way to do this, by the way, the Rishonim points out, is let's say you want to warm water off, you have to pour the water quickly. In other words, if I start pouring the water very slowly, then each little bit of water that enters into the kli rishon is getting heated up. So what I'd have to do is, let's say I take my kettle off the fire, kli rishon, and I want to pour cold water into it. What I have to do is I have to pour the cold water quickly, so that almost immediately it goes ahead and warms it up, as opposed to if I'm pouring a little bit, then each little bit gets hot, and eventually it'll get to a point of warm, but at least the beginning you're going to actually have warmed up, and that would be problematic. Okay, fine. Now let's see the Gemara. My Kamar. What is the statement that the kettle that was cleared? So we'll see two opinions. Amar of Adavar Masna Hachi Kamar. This is what it means. Hamecham shipana mimenu mayim chayim. A kettle from which the water was cleared. Okay, lo yitin l'socho mayim muatim k'dei shechamu. You're not allowed to put a small amount of cold water in it to heat the water. Aval nos l'socho mayim merubim k'dei lafshiran. You're allowed to put a large quantity of water in order to warm the water. Okay. The Gemara asks, wait a second, according to this view that we're talking about putting, that basically you had hot water in this kettle, and then you took all the hot water out, so then you poured cold water into the kettle, what happens is it hardens the steel, right? We saw this yesterday. We spoke about the fact that we do this when we kasher, right? The idea is that if you have hot water and your metal is hot, and then you pour cold water, it actually hardens the steel. So the Gemara answers, Reb Shimon he the Amar Davar She'em Eskavein Mutter. The Gemara, the Mishnah that said that it's mutter to do this is the opinion of Reb Shimon, who says that a Davar She'em Eskavein is allowed. Over here, your goal is not to make the kettle hardened. Your goal is not to be mitzaref the metal. Your goal is just simply to cool off the water, and therefore it's not your intention, and therefore it is mutter. Okay, Maskva Abaya. Abaya doesn't like this approach. He says, Midi, mecham shipana mimenu mayim tani. Does the Mishnah say a kettle from which water was cleared? Again, it doesn't say that a kettle that you took water out of. Rather, mecham shapinau ketani. The Mishnah says the kettle was cleared. Okay, in English it actually doesn't, the question is not as strong. Because if you say a kettle was cleared, that could mean the kettle itself was taken off the fire, or the kettle was cleared of its water. But in Hebrew, it should be mecham shepina mimenu mayim would be the way to say the water was cleared out of it. If you say the kettle was cleared, that implies the kettle itself was cleared off of where it was, implying you took the kettle off. It's not talking about emptying out the kettle, but rather what it means is you took the kettle off of the fire. Okay, so Elam Abai says like this. Understood? So again, in English, it's a little, how can we say this better? Basically, the first opinion was Rav Ada bar Hava, right? Rav Ada bar Masna, excuse me. Rav Ada bar Masna says that you were talking about a kettle that was cleared of its water. That's what the Mishnah means. I took the kettle, I cleared the water out, and then I added a little bit of water, in which case the kettle is making it very hot. Can't do that. Or add a lot of water, and the water that goes in is warm. Okay? Abaya says, if it was talking about a kettle that you cleared of its water, then the terminology should not be mecham shepinahu, the kettle that you cleared it, meaning the kettle. Rather, it should say a mecham, a kettle that you cleared it of its water. Right? The fact that it says a mecham that was cleared implies that you did something to the kettle itself, i.e., you removed the kettle from the fire. And that's the way Abaye understands the Gemara, as we'll see, the Mishnah, as we'll see. Hach-yamar, ha-mecham shepinahu v'yesh bo mayim chaim. A kettle that was cleared, but it still has hot water in it. Lo yitzin l'socha mayim watim b'shvil shechomu. You're not allowed to put a small amount of cold water into it in order to heat it up. Aval nosin l'socha mayim arubim k'dei lafshiran. But you're allowed to put a large quantity of water in order to warm it up. Okay? But there's a implication. The fact that we're talking about a kettle that still has water in it implies umecham shepina mimenu mayim. But if you cleared all of the water out, lo yitin l'socha mayim kolikor, you would not be allowed to put any amount of water into it, mipnei shemitzarif, because the fact that you are indeed going to cause the kettle to be hardened. Right? In other words, there isn't a fundamental disagreement between Rav Ada bar Masna and Abaye about heating up cold water in a kli rishon. Whether it's talking about that there's still water there or there's no water there, they both say putting a little bit of water in a kli rishon is heating up the water and therefore asur. Putting a lot of water in a kli rishon is warming up the water and therefore mutter. That they don't disagree about. But the way you understand this Mishnah does have an implication for a discussion about davar she'ena miskavein. And how so? Because according to the opinion of Ada bar Masna, he's saying that when I clear out the water entirely, I'm allowed to put a lot of hot water in, because a lot of cold water in, because what happens is it just warms the water, and that's fine. The fact that in doing so it hardens the metal, who cares? Rav Shimon, who says davar she'ena miskavein, is mutter. But according to Abaye, he says no. It's dafka talking about where you still have water in it. Why didn't the Mishnah talk about a case where you cleared out the water? Because if there would be no water in it, and you would just be adding cold water to it, it would cause the hardening of the kettle, and that would be asur. Implication, davar she'ena miskavein is asur. Like Rabbi Yehuda, Kiman, right? Rabbi Yehuda, da'amar davar she'ena miskavein asur, who holds that even though you didn't intend to harden the kettle, it's still going to be forbidden. Right? You see the difference, right? In other words, they agree fundamentally about what you're allowed to do in a kli rishon, but the fact Abaye, who from a grammatical place, is coming from, is saying that the Mishnah is talking about dafka where there's still water in there, implying that if there's no water and you just added cold water to it to warm it up, you just add cold water to this hot kettle, it's going to therefore cause the kettle to be hardened, and that's why the Mishnah is not talking about that case, because Rabbi Yehuda holds davar she'ena miskavein is asur. Okay, Amarav, and now we have a similar dispute. Loshanu el lahafshir, the amount of water that is allowed is enough to warm the water. V'letzarif asur, but if it's enough to, if you're going to harden the kettle, it's asur. U'shmuel amar afilu tzarif nami mutter. Even if you're hardening the kettle, it's allowed. Now the Gemara asks on Shmuel, litzarif lechatchila mishari. Is Shmuel allowing you to go ahead and harden the kettle? In other words, that's the implication that Shmuel's saying, I'm allowed to harden the kettle. That'd be hard to understand. No pun intended. You're not allowed to go ahead and harden the kettle. That certainly is doing something on Shabbos. Now the Rishonim disputes about what's the issue, by the way, of hardening a kettle on Shabbos. What issue would there be? What prohibition is there to harden a kettle? I'm sorry, Misakimana, right? So you're basically Makam and Patish, right? Some understand is it Doraisa, is it Drabanan? One way or another, you're basically fixing something, you're building something, and therefore it'd be Aser. Okay, Eliyatmar, Hachitmar, what the way to read it is like this. Amar Rav said, Loshano el shir lahafshir. The amount of water you're allowed to add to a hot kettle is the amount to be warmed. Aval shir litzaref aser. But if you add into an empty kettle the amount that would harden the kettle, it's forbidden. Ushmuel Amar afilu shir litzaref. Shmuel says, not that you're doing it in order to harden, that would be aser. But the measurement to harden, that would be mutter because seemingly Shmuel is going like who? Rav Shimon or Rav Yehuda? Rav Shimon. That's right. Okay, we're going to have to memorize this as we go along. Rav Shimon is the one who holds davar she'eno miskavein mutter. Remember the shins over there. I don't know. That's how I do it.
It's confusing because earlier we quoted... Oh, Shimon, yeah. Rav Shimon is up there, yeah.
Okay, so again, he holds davar she'eno miskavein mutter, and therefore Shmuel is saying, I'm allowed to pour into an empty kettle the amount of water that would be enough to make it warm, to cool off the water which would be enough. That would indeed cause the kettle to be hardened. Nonetheless, it's mutter because the fact that it's davar she'eno miskavein, it's not his intent. Now the Gemara questions the fact that Shmuel is going like Rav Shimon, okay, on davar she'eno miskavein. L'meimer to Shmuel, Rabbi Shimon Svirle. Are you telling me that Shmuel holds like Rav Shimon that something which is eno miskavein is mutter? Shmuel, doesn't Shmuel say mechaben gachela shamateches b'reshus harabim? A person is allowed to extinguish burning metal in reshus harabim b'shvil shlo yizoku b'rabim in order to prevent harm to the public. Avalo gachela shel eitz, but not a piece of burning wood. Okay, so what's going on over here? You have wood that is when you have a fire, to extinguish a fire, it really depends on the type. So a wood fire is extinguishing a wood fire. Let's say doing it for its own purpose. You don't want you want to extinguish it. We saw this earlier in the second parak. It depends on why you're extinguishing it. Are you doing it because you don't want the heat here? You don't want the fire here? That's called melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. Right? Or is it that you actually want something about the ashes? Let's say you wanted the pecham, right? You wanted like the ashes themselves, and that would be malacha shetricha legufa, right? So there, that's a general that's a malacha shetricha legufa. So there's a general debate about malacha shetricha legufa. Again, davar she'eno miskavein is one discussion. Now we've moved on to a different discussion, but it's also a place where Rav Shimon and Rav Yehuda argue, and it's a similar type of principle. Rav Shimon says davar she'eno miskavein mutter. He also holds malacha she'ena tzricha legufa is mutter. In other words, if I extinguish a fire, not because I need the fire extinguished, but I don't want a fire here. So I'm not doing, meaning whenever we have a malacha, we want it for a constructive purpose, right? The example, an easier example of this is, I have something in my house. It smells bad, right? My house is Rishus Yachid. Outdoors, no Erev, it's Rishus Harabim. I take it outside, okay, because I don't want it to smell in my house, right? I'm not doing it for a higher purpose of that I want the food outside, like when in the opening lines of Masech Shabbos where I gave the bread to the poor person outside. I want the bread outside. I'm doing it for the constructive purpose of bringing food outside. Whereas that's called B'lacha Shetrich Legufa. Whereas if I'm taking the garbage out, I'm not doing it because I want the garbage outside. I just don't want it here. Right? So that's the idea of malacha she'ena tzrich legufa. So basically, Rav Shimon also holds malacha she'ena tzrich legufa is mutter. Okay, so what does that have to do with this idea of so basically when you extinguish a fire, in order that the fire doesn't damage someone, that's malacha she'ena tzrich legufa. Okay, and we see that Shmuel is saying that when it's a wooden fire, a fire with wood, which is a fire d'oraisa, extinguishing such a fire is d'oraisa, he holds you're not allowed to do so. With metal, which is Drabanan, he allows it. But a fire which is Joraisa, by wood, he says you're not allowed to do so. So, Rav Shimon, but if you hold that Shmuel holds like Rav Shimon across the board, then afil shel eitz nami. Then he should allow you to extinguish the fire of wood as well. Why? Because extinguishing it so people don't get hurt you're not doing it legufa for itself. You're not doing it for a higher purpose. Rather, you're doing it because I don't want the fire here to hurt someone else. You hear the question? Yeah? So Gemara says, what you probably already assumed, the davar she'en miskavein tzavlak Rav Shimon. No, we're going to distinguish. When we say he holds like Rav Shimon, it doesn't mean he holds about all malachos. In other words, Rav Shimon's views are obviously related one with the other. He holds davar she'en miskavein mutter. He holds malacha she'en tzrich legufa mutter. And so you could assume that someone who holds like Rav Shimon lumps them all together, because clearly Rav Shimon has this very high bar of what you are chayav for when it comes to malachos. A, it has to be miskavein. B, it has to be legufa. But one could distinguish between those categories, right? The Gemara's assumption was they're all the same. The Gemara's answer is no, you could distinguish. When it comes to something that's unintended, right? Then he holds like Rav Shimon. Like one of the examples that comes up all the time is pulling a heavy bench in a public place. You're going to dig a furrow, plowing, right? But it's not your intention. There he holds like Rav Shimon. When it comes to labor that's not needed for its intended defined purpose, meaning like extinguishing a coal, so two people don't get hurt, some like Rabbi Yehuda, there he holds like Rabbi Yehuda and says that would be midoraisa. Okay, I'm Ravina, and therefore now that we see, now fine, that's our conclusion. Shmuel holds like Rav Shimon by Davar Shem Neskaven. He doesn't hold b'melacha she'ein tzrich legufa. Fine. Okay, but now one last line. Amar Ravina, Hilkach Kotes B'Rishus Ram. Let's say you have a thorn in a public domain, okay, with no Erev. Molicho, so basically now that we see, just now we're going on a tangent, but an important tangent. Shmuel clearly holds that when it comes to a Isra Durabanan, like the Gacheles, on a mateches, which is durabanan, he holds you allowed to do malacha in order to prevent harming the masses. I'm not talking about something which is lethal. Obviously, something lethal, you'd be able, if you had a fire that was potentially going to kill people, chas v'shalom, you'll not be allowed to do anything. We're talking about something which is going to harm people. People are going to get hurt. People are going to get a little burnt. Nothing, but we're not talking about anything lethal. And Shmuel said that when it came to a coal, that it came to a metal fire, you're allowed to extinguish it, right? Even though it's a iser durabanan. So Amar Ravina, Hilkach Kotes B'Rishus Rabim. When it comes to a thorn in a public domain, Molicho Pachos Me'arba Amos, you're allowed to move it less than 4 amos at a time. Uvecharmelis Afila Tuva, and if it's right, so moving it less than 4 amos at a time is fine. Uvecharmelis, in a place where it's only going to be durabanan to move it, you're allowed to move it even more amos at a time. The bottom line is that you're allowed to move things which would be otherwise Isser Durabanan on Shabbos. So basically, let's say you're walking on the street. So this comes up. Let's say we have an Erev, but you have some glass on the street. So to kick it is certainly allowed. There you're moving Kalach Yad. But let's say the only way to move this glass out of the way, and you should kick it. It's the right thing to do. And move it out of the way. But let's say the only way to move this damaging thing is to pick it up, which we're typically talking about something which is damaging. Typically is going to be a muksa item. I don't know. Let's say you see something which is muksa on the floor. You have a big piece of glass. The only way to move it is to pick it up. So if it's going to be hurting, so something happens in your house, something falls in your house, and which is otherwise muksa, but it could hurt someone. Someone could walk, they could step on it, they could, if person could, whatever, something could hurt, and therefore, even though it'd be asur midrabanan to do so, typically, but to save people from any harm, you'd be allowed to go ahead and move it, and that's what not just is allowed, but it is we're obligated to go ahead and prevent people from getting harm, and that's what a person should do. Parenthetically, generally speaking, we pass like Rav Shimon, the Melach Shein Tzrich Legufa is Davar Shem Neskaven is mutter, except, and we'll get into this as well, something called a psik resha, where the Davar Shem Neskaven is definitely going to happen. Then he does not say that, but when it's Davar Shem Neskaven, which is not necessarily going to happen, it could happen. Then he would then we would typically go like Rav Shimon. We'll see other practical applications of this as we go along. Have a great day.